Welcome back today, guys, to part 2 of our Crash Course review videos. Today we're going to be going over the American Revolution, which are standards 8.13 to 8.20. So let's go ahead and get started. So 8.13, we're going to explain the significance of the Ohio River Valley leading to the French and Indian War and the events and consequences of the conflict, including the massacre at Fort Loudoun, the Treaty of Paris of 1763, war debt, and the Proclamation line of 1763. So let's start off with the Ohio River Valley. This is a scene of rivalry between France and Great Britain. It's valuable to France because of the trade with American Indians, and for Britain, it was land that settlers had already moved to. This rivalry led to the French and Indian War for this area. All right, so the French and Indian War, both sides had American Indian allies. And the British defeated the French and drove the French from North America. All right, so Fort Loudoun. Fort Loudoun was a British fort built in Tennessee that served as a trading post for British colonists and the Cherokee Indians. Now, relations broke down between the British and Cherokee, and in 1760, Cherokees laid siege to the fort and cut off supplies. The officers of the fort surrendered and let 200 people go to South Carolina. The Cherokee attacked and killed more than 20 people in this group. So the Treaty of Paris of 1763 ended the French and Indian War. France had to give up all of its North American colonies in Canada and what would become the United States. Spanish Florida was also given to the British in the Treaty of Paris of 1763. Now, war debt also comes from the French and Indian War. So the British had large amounts of war debt from the French and Indian War, and Britain needed money to pay these debts and cover the cost of its army protecting the colonies. So they began to impose taxes on the colonies. The last part's the Proclamation line of 1763. This line prohibited colonists from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. Land west of the line was given to American Indians to avoid warfare with settlers. Now, there was 3 goals for this: to make peace with the Native Americans, because they hoped to start a trade relationship with the Native Americans, and they wanted to defend its colonies by building forts along the Proclamation line. Now, the line angered colonists who wanted to settle the frontier west of the Appalachian Mountains, and colonists continued to push west anyways, and Britain had a hard time enforcing the Proclamation. All right, so 8.14, moving on. Explain the political contributions of Benjamin Franklin to the United States, including the join or die cartoon and the Albany Plan of Union. All right, so Ben Franklin tried to convince the members of a colonial Congress in Albany, New York, to unite against France and defend the colonies before the French and Indian War broke out. So Franklin proposed the Albany Plan of Union. It called for colonial representatives to make decisions for the colonies on matters dealing with defense, organizing an army, collecting taxes, and relations with American Indians. The Albany Plan was adopted by the Congress, but the colonial assemblies didn't approve it. So this plan would go on to become inspiration for future leaders who wanted the colonies to unite as a whole. The Join or Die cartoon, which is seen there to the right, was drawn by Benjamin Franklin. It was first published in the Pennsylvania Gazette in 1754. The pieces of the snake represent the colonies and are labeled as such. It encourages the colonies to come together and fight, or they may die. And this kind of comes back during the American Revolution, okay, but first written for the French and Indian War. 8.15, we're going to analyze the social, political, and economic causes of the events and groups of the American Revolution, including the Quartering Act of 1765, the Boston Massacre of 1770, the Stamp Act of 1765, the Boston Tea Party of 1773, the Declaratory Act of 1766, the Intolerable/Coercive Acts of 1774, the Townsend Acts of 1767, and the Sons of Liberty. All right. So the Quartering Act of 1765 says the colonists had to give room and board to British soldiers stationed in the colonies. Now, the colonists saw this as another tax because they had to spend money to take care of British troops. The Stamp Act is also passed in 1765. This said the colonists had to buy a government stamp for almost every paper document, such as newspapers and legal documents. The Stamp Act was intended to pay for troops that defended the frontiers. Colonists didn't like it because they saw it as a way for Britain to make money without colonial approval. Britain repealed the Stamp Act a year later due to resistance. So next comes the Declaratory Act in 1766. It was passed the same day the Stamp Act was repealed. It declared the colonists were part of the British Empire and had virtual representation in Parliament. So Britain had complete authority to pass any law they saw fit for the colonies. Later come the Townsend Acts in 1767. Colonists had to pay taxes on tea, glass, paper, lead, and paint, all of which they had to buy from Britain. Colonists again cried out over taxation without representation, and resistance to the acts continued. All right, next is the Boston Massacre in 1770. Tensions and conflicts between British troops and colonists over the Townsend Acts were growing. On March 5th, 1770, colonists gathered to protest taxes. Colonists began insulting and arguing with British soldiers. An object struck one of the troops and he fired into the crowd, and other soldiers fired as well. 5 colonists were killed in the massacre, and the massacre united the colonists more against the British. Next is the Boston Tea Party in 1773. The British repealed most of the Townsend Acts in 1770, but the tax on tea remained. Britain passed the Tea Act in 1773, and colonists didn't like the act, so of course protests followed. On December 16, 1773, colonists dressed as Native Americans dumped hundreds of chests of British tea into Boston Harbor, and this became known as the Boston Tea Party. Following the Boston Tea Party came the Intolerable or Coercive Acts, which were passed in 1774. This was punishment for the Boston Tea Party. Okay, so these acts closed the port of Boston until the colonies paid for the dumped tea, banned town meetings, and placed a military governor in control of Massachusetts. It created a new quartering act, and colonists responded by creating the first Continental Congress. Last thing we have to talk about is the Sons of Liberty. It was a secret patriotic society that organized protests and boycotts of the Stamp Act and the Townsend Acts. All right. So 8.16, explain the historical purposes and consequences of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. So in Common Sense, Payne urged a break from Great Britain and criticized British rule, claiming that Britain's rule was a threat to colonists' liberty. Okay, called for a democracy, sold about 500,000 copies by the end of the Revolution, and convinced many colonists to support the revolutionary movement. All right, 8.17, locate and explain the significance of the battles of the American Revolution prior to the signing of the Declaration of Independence, including Lexington and Concord and Bunker/Breed's Hill. All right, so Lexington and Concord happened on April 19th of 1775. These are the first battles of the American Revolution. So colonial militias were storing ammunition in Concord, Massachusetts, and the British headed to seize the supplies and arrest colonial leaders. Paul Revere and William Dawes rode through the night on April 18th to warn that the British were coming. British troops and colonists met in Lexington when someone fired a shot. The British beat the colonists at Lexington and then moved on to Concord. Now the colonial militia at Concord were able to defeat the British and used guerrilla warfare to chase the British back to Boston. The main significance, these are the first 2 battles of the American Revolution. Bunker Hill. The colonial militia surrounded Boston to keep British troops from raiding the countryside like they did at Concord and Lexington. Now, the colonial militia built a defense on Breed's Hill, and the British set out to take it. Now, the colonists resisted well at first, but the British soon made it to the top of the hill, and the colonists had to retreat. Now, this is important because the British suffered heavy losses, and it boosted the morale of the colonists. The battle showed that the colonists were ready to challenge the British troops, and this wouldn't be an easy war for the British. All right, 8.18, explain the historical and present-day significance of the Declaration of Independence. So on July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Independence. It announced that the colonies were united in the fight for independence. Thomas Jefferson was the main author of the Declaration, and his famous line was, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." Now, the Declaration was seen as treason to Great Britain. The colonists hoped to win support from foreign nations to aid them in the fight. All right, there are 3 main parts of the Declaration. The Preamble is first, it explains the reasons behind the colonists' decision to separate from Great Britain. Again, this is kind of like the introductory paragraph. List of grievances lists 27 complaints against King George in Parliament. Some of them being that he dissolved colonial legislators and denied rights to self-government. He kept a standing army in the colonies and imposed taxes on colonists without their consent. Okay, some of the main reasons why we wrote the Bill of Rights. All right, and then there's the conclusion. This officially declared the colonists free and announced the formation of the United States of America. 8.19, compare and contrast the points of view of loyalists and patriots. Loyalists, okay, wanted to stay loyal to Great Britain. It's kind of in the name. These were mainly people who had been born in England. All right, older people still felt more like a British subject and wanted to preserve that relationship. And loyalists were mostly farmers in the South who depended on shipping their crops to Great Britain. Loyalists wanted to remain loyal for economic concerns. Okay, they wanted to keep making money. Patriots, on the other hand, of course, supported independence from Great Britain. They wanted to be free of king's tyranny and unfair taxes. They wanted to make their own rules and laws and viewed the American Revolution as a necessary fight. All right. Last one, 8.20, locate and explain the significance of the following during the American Revolution. Struggles of the Continental Army, the Battle of Saratoga, the battles of Trenton and Princeton, the Battle of Yorktown, the Battle of Kings Mountain, and guerrilla warfare. All right, so struggles of the Continental Army. Of course, George Washington was the leader. All right, but the struggles included they were a ragtag army. Troops didn't want to leave home, colonies, and they had no military training. Distance was another struggle. It took a long time to receive food, supplies, and communications. And the United States had no money. So we didn't have enough money to buy guns or food. Now, the Battle of Saratoga. Battle of Saratoga is important because the Patriot victory prompted France to sign a treaty of alliance. So this is what gets France involved on our side of the war, is the Battle of Saratoga. Battles of Trenton and Princeton. Washington crossed the Delaware River on Christmas Eve and then defeated the British forces at Trenton and Princeton. This greatly raised the morale of the Continental Army. Battle of Kings Mountain, Patriot riflemen from what is now Tennessee defeated the Loyalists using guerrilla warfare. This victory basically ended the British campaign in the South. All right, guerrilla warfare is important because this is what the Patriots used a lot. It's to use a small group of forces to carry out irregular attacks and raids on a large force. Think of like your Fortnite and your Call of Duty. That's more of your guerrilla warfare. All right. The Battle of Yorktown. This is the battle that ends the American Revolution. So troops from the Continental Army trapped the British on a peninsula at Yorktown and laid siege. French ships blocked the British from getting help by sea. The British surrender effectively ended the American Revolution at Yorktown. So Yorktown, Y at the very end of the alphabet, the very end of the American Revolution. All right. Here's a map to show you kind of where some of those battles are. Saratoga's up here in New York, Princeton and Trenton in New Jersey, Yorktown in Virginia, and Kings Mountain here in South Carolina. All right. So that is the end of part 2. All right. If you have any questions, please let me know. But if not, then we will see y'all next time.